On Christmas Day, my mother gave my sister a designer handbag worth 600 euros. She gave me a used candle and mocked me. Well, that's all you're good for. Maybe you can sell it for lunch, my brother scoffed. I placed the candle on the table in silence and left the house. An hour later, my Aunt Mercedes burst in shouting. This happened last Christmas. I was sitting awkwardly on the edge of the living room sofa, pretending not to notice that my sister, Valeria, was opening her sixth expensive gift while my brother, Alvaro, made jokes at my expense. Carmen, my mother, drank wine, smiling to herself. When it was finally time for my gift, Carmen handed me a used candle with a haughty shrug and said, "Well, that's all you're good for." Alvaro chuckled and said, "Maybe she can sell it for lunch." I left the candle without a word and went out into the snow. About an hour later, my Aunt Mercedes showed up, and I swear the whole house shook from the argument that erupted when she found out what had happened. When people talk about Christmas memories, they usually refer to laughter by the fireplace, matching pajamas, and the aroma of cinnamon cookies. I always wanted that. God, how I wished for it. But our Christmases were another kind of tradition, the kind where the air felt thick, like holding your breath the whole time, waiting for the next little cruelty. I arrived at the family house in Salamanca around noon, with the windshield wipers squeaking against the falling snow. Part of me considered driving around the block a few more times. I wasn't late on purpose. I was just buying myself a few extra minutes of calm. When I finally went inside, Carmen barely looked up from the sofa where she was sitting next to Valeria, adjusting the bow on her newly opened designer bag. "There she is," she said with a smirk, without even pausing. Valeria turned and gave me a tense little smile, the kind you give a coworker you secretly hate. Alvaro was sprawled in the recliner, already with the remote in his hand, laughing at a joke I hadn't heard. I carefully hung my coat by the door. The house still looked the same, the old red brick fireplace, the wooden beams on the ceiling. But it didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't for years. I tried to slip discreetly into a chair, hoping to go unnoticed, but hope was a dangerous thing in my family. Carmen clapped dramatically. "Oh, we almost forgot about Alejandra." The way she said it, as if it were a joke. Valeria snorted softly. Alvaro just watched, a slow smile creeping across his face. Carmen grabbed a wrinkled gift bag from the side table and held it out to me between two fingers as if it were something dirty. I took it without saying anything. Inside was a candle. The wick was black, half the wax melted, the label torn, but you could still read the word vanilla. "That's all you're good for," Carmen said, laughing to herself. Alvaro tossed a crumpled napkin across the room. "Maybe she can sell it for lunch," he said. Valeria laughed so hard she snorted, hugging her designer bag as if it were going to fly away. For a long second, I just stared at the candle in my hands. Something inside me, something I had been holding together with duct tape and hope for years, finally broke. I stood up, placed the candle gently on the coffee table, and walked out the front door into the blinding white snow. Nobody called after me, not a single one. My boots crunched on the ice. I didn't even grab my coat. I was too stunned, too numb, and not from the cold. I got halfway down the street when Aunt Mercedes' red Seat Ibiza pulled up beside me. She rolled down the window, looking at me, alarmed. "Alejandra, are you okay?" I shook my head, hugging myself. I couldn't even form words. Mercedes frowned, parking by the curb. Without hesitation, she got out, slammed the door shut, and wrapped her coat around me. "Come on," she said, guiding me back toward the house. I followed her, dazed. I didn't want to, but my feet moved on their own. When we got back, the front door was still half open, letting in gusts of icy air. Nobody inside seemed to notice. Carmen was pouring more wine. Alvaro was turning on his new video game console. Valeria was showing off her bag on a WhatsApp video call. Mercedes walked in like a soldier in enemy territory. "What the hell happened here?" she yelled, loud enough to cut through the noise. Carmen looked up, annoyed. What do you mean? Mercedes pointed sharply at the candle, still on the coffee table. You gave her that? Valeria rolled her eyes. Alvaro muttered something I couldn't understand. Does this seem funny to you? Mercedes' voice rose. Does it seem like a joke to treat her like trash? Carmen's face hardened. It's none of your business. Mercedes let out a bitter, ugly laugh. Now it is. I stepped back toward the door, my heart pounding. I didn't know if I wanted to run or stay. I felt like a ghost witnessing my own funeral. You've been cruel to her for years, Mercedes said, her voice trembling. And for what? She continued. Because she reminds you of the husband who left you? Because you can't stand to look at the only person who achieved something on her own without your help. Carmen's mouth opened and then closed. She was cornered, and she knew it. You don't deserve her, Mercedes said, lower now, but with firmness in her voice. You never deserved her. For the first time in years, I saw something break in my mother's expression. It wasn't guilt. She was too proud for that. But it was something like fear, the fear of losing control. Valeria crossed her arms, protecting her designer bag. Alvaro pretended to tangle the wires of his console, avoiding eye contact at all costs. Nobody said a word as Mercedes took my hand and led me out the door. We got into her red Seat Ibiza and sat there for a while in silence. The heater turned on, fogging the windows. You don't have to go back, she finally said. You never have to go back. I looked at my trembling hands in my lap. I don't know where to go, I whispered. Come home with me, she said without hesitation. Tonight, tomorrow, as long as you need. My eyes filled with tears so quickly I couldn't contain them. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt seen. I felt loved. Mercedes drove carefully through the snow, her hand steady on the wheel. I rested my head against the window and watched the white landscape blur. We stopped at Bar Restaurante La Parada on the outskirts of town, one of those old places with flickering neon signs and cracked vinyl seats. She ordered pancakes and hot chocolate for both of us, even though it was late afternoon. I couldn't eat much, but I drank the chocolate. It warmed me from the inside. Mercedes didn't pressure me to talk, just let me sit there, absorbing the warmth, the sound of dishes, the low voices around us. At some point, I realized I was smiling a little. It felt strange, like using forgotten muscles. I should have intervened sooner, Mercedes said softly as her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. I thought maybe they'd realize it on their own, that they'd wake up. They never were going to, I said, surprising myself with how firm my voice sounded. She nodded, her lips tight. Maybe it's better this way, I added. Clean break. Mercedes looked at me with something like pride in her eyes. Maybe, she said. Maybe so. The snow continued to fall outside, thick and endless, and for the first time in a long, long time, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could build something better with the pieces they had left me. The restaurant smelled of bacon grease and maple syrup. The warm air coming out of the old vents hummed softly. It was the kind of place where nobody was in a hurry, where the waitress called you honey and left extra cream on the table without asking. Mercedes and I stayed on the bench for a long time, drinking lukewarm coffee and hot chocolate, watching the snow pile up outside. Neither of us seemed eager to move. At one point, my phone vibrated on the table. I didn't look at it, but Mercedes did. I saw her eyes narrow slightly. Carmen? I asked softly. She nodded. A few messages. I put the phone face down without reading them. I already knew what they would say. They wouldn't be apologies, but accusations. How dare I embarrass them? How dare I ruin Christmas? There was a time when a single cold message from my mother could send me into a spiral of guilt and shame. But sitting there across from Mercedes, the weight felt different, lighter somehow. You don't have to answer, she said, stirring her coffee gently. I know, I replied, and I meant it. When we finally gathered our things and went back out to the car, the world outside looked different, softer, quieter. The streets were slick with fresh snow, and the Christmas lights on porches and storefronts twinkled in the distance, muted, far away. Mercedes' house in Candelaria wasn't far, a cozy one-story chalet tucked behind a row of tall pines. Her driveway was half buried, but she forged ahead, the tires crunching, sliding a little. Inside, the house was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke and sugar cookies. She had a small artificial tree in the corner, decorated with simple red and gold ornaments. Nothing ostentatious, but it felt real, welcoming. Her 2 golden retrievers, Molly and Gus, rushed to greet us, their tails thumping against the walls. I knelt down to hug them, grateful for their noisy, uncomplicated love. "You can stay in the guest room," Mercedes said, taking off her boots, "or on the sofa, whichever you prefer." I chose the guest room, a small space with a handmade quilt on the bed and a window overlooking the snow-covered backyard. There was a bookshelf full of old paperbacks and a reading lamp that cast a soft, yellow glow. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking at my hands. Somewhere down the hall, Mercedes put on music, old Christmas classics. She kept the volume low enough to be background, not an imposition of cheer. I finally took off my boots, wincing at how cold and wet my socks were. Mercedes knocked softly on the door and handed me a pair of thick wool socks. "I made them last winter," she said with a small smile. "I thought you might need them." I put them on, and for some reason, that simple act of kindness loosened something inside me. I pressed my palms against my eyes, swallowing hard to contain the wave of emotion that threatened to drown me. Mercedes didn't say anything, just sat quietly in the hallway until I was ready. That night, after I'd showered and borrowed an old sweatshirt of hers, we sat together on the sofa with mugs of hot tea. Molly rested his head in my lap, snoring softly. "You know," Mercedes said, "when your father left, I thought your mother would rise to the occasion. I thought she would rally you all, protect you." I looked at my tea, watching the tiny ripples my breath caused. "But she didn't," Mercedes continued. "She hardened. She chose favorites. And you were the easiest to blame." I nodded. There was nothing more to say. "You didn't deserve it," she said simply. Nobody had ever said that to me out loud. I'd screamed it into pillows, yes, but hearing it like this, calmly, without drama, was like someone opening a door inside me. I just sat there, letting the truth settle in. My phone vibrated again on the coffee table. I ignored it. Instead, I picked up a small ceramic snowman from Mercedes' side table and turned it over in my hands. It was chipped and old, a piece of its scarf missing. "I found that at a flea market years ago," Mercedes said, smiling. "One of the best euros I ever spent." I smiled back, a real smile this time. I realized then how the small things, broken snowmen, knitted socks, pancakes at midnight, could stitch together a better life than any grand gesture or expensive gift. I spent the next few days at Mercedes' house. We watched old movies, baked cookies from a box, and took the dogs for short, slippery walks. It wasn't magical or Instagram-worthy. It was ordinary. It was real. Carmen kept sending messages. Valeria, too, half-hearted, feigned attempts to guilt me into coming back. I didn't reply. Alvaro sent one message that almost made me laugh. "You're making a drama out of nothing." I didn't even bother to reply. On the third day, Mercedes found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the frosted window at the snow-covered pines. "Are you thinking about going back?" she asked carefully. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Good," she said, setting a plate of toast in front of me. "They don't deserve another piece of you." I picked at the toast, still without much appetite. "But what if they never change?" I whispered. Mercedes sat across from me, her face kind but firm. "They won't," she said. "They'll do what's easy. The one who needs to change is you." I spent the whole morning thinking about that. About how much of my life I'd spent trying to earn scraps of love. How many Christmases, birthdays, and graduations I'd endured, hoping for something different, and ending up shattered every time. Maybe Mercedes was right. Maybe waiting for them to change was just another way of staying trapped. That night, after dinner, I took out my phone. I didn't reply. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply blocked all three of them. Carmen, Valeria, Alvaro. My hand shook a little as I did it, but afterward, the air felt cleaner, clearer, like opening a window in a room that had been shut for years. Mercedes noticed. She didn't say anything, but she smiled faintly as she flipped channels on the TV. We ended up watching an old black-and-white Christmas movie. I don't remember the title, but I remember sitting under a thick blanket with Gus at my feet and a peace I hadn't felt for years. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a big movie moment. It was just me, breathing easier for the first time in a long time. The days blended together after that. The snow kept falling outside, steady and silent, blanketing the world in white. I didn't go back to my apartment right away. Mercedes didn't ask when I was planning to leave, and I appreciated her quiet understanding. Every morning, I'd wake up to the smell of fresh coffee and the low murmur of the radio playing classics in the kitchen. Mercedes always made breakfast for two, whether I was hungry or not. Sometimes we'd sit in silence, flipping through newspapers, sipping slowly while the daylight struggled to break through the clouds. I kept waiting for the guilt to show up. A part of me still thought I owed my mother something, to forgive her, to fix things. But the longer I stayed away, the lower the volume of that voice became. One morning, while I was wrapped in one of Mercedes' enormous sweaters, aimlessly browsing job postings on my laptop, she set a small pile of pamphlets in front of me. I looked at her, confused. "Just some ideas," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Workshops, classes, things you might like." There were flyers for writing courses at the community center, volunteering opportunities at the library, an ad for a book club that met once a month at El Rinson Cafe. It hit me harder than I expected, how she saw possibilities where I only saw emptiness, how she thought I could have a future beyond just surviving. "I don't know," I said, my voice a little shaky. "I feel so behind." Mercedes leaned back in her chair, studying me thoughtfully. "Behind what?" she asked. "Life isn't a race." I looked at my hands, feeling that familiar old shame prickle inside me. I thought of Valeria, with her perfect career, her expensive bags. Of Alvaro, with his easy jokes and his natural charm. Of Carmen, always performing like we were the ideal family when anyone was watching. Compared to them, I felt like a failure. "You survived all that," Mercedes said, as if reading my mind. "That's not nothing, Alejandra. That's everything." Something loosened in my chest at those words. I didn't cry, not then, but I felt it, that slow release, like someone untying a knot that had been choking me for years. That afternoon, we took the dogs to Los Alamos Park. The sidewalks were treacherously icy, and we walked carefully, laughing each time one of us slipped a little. Molly bounded ahead, forging a path through drifts of snow taller than herself. Gus kept close, his breath forming little clouds in the air. As we walked, Mercedes told me about her own life, the parts I'd never known, about how she'd married young and divorced young, how she'd spent years feeling broken because she never remarried, never had children of her own. "I used to think something was wrong with me," she said, adjusting her scarf. "But then I realized I was just building a different kind of life." We stopped by a frozen pond. The surface was smooth and gleaming under the gray sky. A few kids were skating awkwardly, their parents yelling warnings from the shore. "I don't know what kind of life I'm supposed to build," I admitted softly. Mercedes smiled, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Whatever kind you want," she replied simply. That night, I pulled an old notebook out of my bag, one I hadn't touched for years. I used to use it when I was younger. It was filled with half-finished poems and stories nobody had ever read. I sat by the fire, pen in hand, staring at the blank page for a long time. I didn't know where to start. It was all too big, too raw. But eventually, the words began to come, clumsy at first, like a newborn calf, then steadier, clearer. I wrote about the snow, about the silence, about starting over. Mercedes didn't interrupt. She just brought me a mug of tea, set it beside me, and ruffled my hair like she used to when I was a child, a gesture so small, but that meant everything. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the guest room window, the first real sunlight in days. It illuminated the frost on the glass, creating glittering patterns, almost as if nature had carved stained glass just for me. I sat up slowly, stretching, feeling the stiffness accumulated from so many nights curled up against the cold and the fear. But this day felt different, lighter, freer. I padded barefoot into the kitchen and found Mercedes humming softly as she mixed cookie dough. Without thinking, I grabbed an apron from the hook and joined her. We moved around each other as if we'd been sharing a kitchen for years. No sharp words, no tense glances, just the easy comfort of people who choose each other, every day. You know, Mercedes said as we kneaded the dough, I could use a roommate. I froze, rolling pin in midair. Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden. Mercedes let out a bark of laughter. Please. I've spent far too long with only the dogs for company. I'd love to have someone to yell at the TV with. I smiled. I felt something inside me breathe. I'll think about it, I said, but we both knew I was already thinking yes. That afternoon, while she walked the dogs, I sat down with my laptop and applied for a few freelance writing jobs. Blog posts, product descriptions, nothing glamorous, but a start. It both scared and excited me. The messages from my family began to dwindle. A couple more from Valeria. A call from Alvaro that I let go to voicemail. I didn't listen to it. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. Mercedes came back, laughing as she stamped the snow off her boots, and we helped Gus, who had gotten tangled up in a branch. We laughed so hard our stomachs hurt. For the first time, I didn't feel like a spectator. I was there. I was home. Weeks passed. The snow melted, and my life, too, began to take shape. I accepted more writing assignments for a candle company, for a gardening blog, nothing glamorous, but enough to pay the bills. I was doing it on my own. Mercedes and I fell into an easy rhythm. Dog walks, simple dinners, quiet Sundays at the Saturday flea market or the bookstore around the corner. She didn't rush me, just let me heal. The further away I got from my family, the clearer I saw it. I hadn't deserved how they treated me, not as a child, not as an adult. And they weren't going to take up space in my head anymore. But I knew I couldn't just disappear. I needed to close the circle, prove that they hadn't broken me, that I'd survived and grown. Months later, I received an email from the Candelario Institute. They were holding a ceremony for distinguished alumni. Mercedes had nominated me in secret. She'd mentioned my articles, the volunteering at the library, the free workshops I was giving at the community center. They were offering me the Merit Award. When the official invitation arrived, thick and engraved, my hand shook. You should go, Mercedes said, setting a mug of tea beside me. I nodded. I would. But I also knew who else would find out. 2 weeks before the event, Valeria texted me. Saw your name on the alumni list. Mom says you'll make a fool of yourself. LOL. I didn't reply. The day of the ceremony, I dressed simply. Navy blue dress, low heels, silver jewelry that Mercedes had given me for Christmas. When I arrived, the auditorium was packed. In the front rows sat Carmen, Valeria, and Alvaro. I hadn't invited them. They'd come on their own, perhaps looking for a new way to humiliate me. I walked past them without looking and went up on stage when my name was called. The director, a kind-eyed woman, spoke about resilience, about starting over, about finding success without fame or fortune, just with courage. I spoke with a steady voice. I thanked my mentors, my community, the people who had supported me. My family I didn't mention. The applause was genuine. Mercedes clapped loudest of all, her eyes shining. I saw Carmen's face, tight, pale, furious. Valeria muttered something. uncomfortable for the first time. Alvaro pretended to look at his phone. They hadn't expected me to rise. They wanted me small, broken. But seeing me standing there, honored, respected, was a better revenge than any shouting match. Afterward, former teachers and classmates came up to congratulate me. Carmen tried to approach, hesitant, but Mercedes appeared at my side. "Come on, they're serving cake in the lobby," she said lightly. We left without looking back. That night, on the sofa, we ate leftover cake on paper plates. The dogs slept at our feet. The fire crackled. I thought about everything I'd lost and everything I'd found. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the life I'd dreamed of. It was better because it was mine.